is completely unacceptable!
I am Dr. Alicia Reed. I am the Chief of Surgery.
I don't know who let you wander up to my floor, but housekeeping doesn't get a key card past the lobby, Gary Hutchins said, loud enough for the nurses' station to hear. He was holding a 30-gallon trash bag in one fist, and he was looking at the woman in the plain gray cardigan like she was something the building had forgotten to throw out. She didn't answer. She just stood there, badge turned backward on its clip, a clipboard pressed flat against her stomach. Hutchins took one step closer and let the bag tip. Coffee grounds, a torn sandwich wrapper, and a wet paper towel slid out across her shoes and the hem of her slacks. The sound was small, a soft slap against tile, but it carried down the whole corridor. Nobody moved. A medcart stopped rolling. Somewhere behind the nurse's station, a phone camera lifted an inch, then dropped again. Afraid, she looked down at her shoes. She did not look up at him. Her hand, the one not holding the clipboard, closed slowly into a fist at her side, knuckles whitening, and then opened again, flat against her thigh. A bead of coffee sat on the toe of her left shoe, brown going dark against the leather, and she watched it slide off and land on the tile rather than watch his face. The smell hid a half-second behind the sound, sour grounds, and something sweeter underneath it, spoiled creamer maybe, and it would stay in her memory longer than anything he said. In 9 days, Gary Hutchins would be standing in that same corridor, reading an apology off an index card his own attorney had written for him, and every person who watched him spill that bag would understand exactly what they had been looking at.
Yo, hold on. He just dumped trash on a woman in a hospital hallway and didn't even blink. Whoever she is, whatever's coming, I already need it. Let's get into it. Her name was Dr.
Imani Reeves, and 6 days earlier she had accepted the position of Chief of Surgery at Eastlake Memorial, a 300-bed teaching hospital with a marble lobby, a donor wall the size of a school bus, and a reputation that pulled patients from 4 states. She had not announced it on the floor yet. She liked to walk a new building quietly before anyone learned her title, liked to see how a hospital treated people when it assumed nobody important was watching. It was a habit from a childhood where almost nobody had ever assumed she was important. She had grown up 2 hours south, in a house with a kerosene heater that hissed all winter, and a roof that needed a bucket in the hallway every time it rained hard enough. The linoleum in the kitchen had peeled back at the corner near the stove, and she used to press it flat with her bare heel while she did homework at the table. Her grandmother, May Reeves, had raised her alone, working the cafeteria line at a county hospital for 31 years, coming home every night smelling of bleach and steamed carrots, hands cracked from the dishwater, knuckles swollen by the time she turned 60. Some winters the heel of a loaf of bread was the whole lunch, folded into a paper sack, and Imani never once complained about it, because she understood, even as a child, what it cost May to keep that sack full at all. May kept a single photograph on the mantel, Imani at 9 years old, holding a third-place ribbon from a county science fair, grinning with a missing tooth. May used to say that ribbon was the only proof she needed that the Lord had plans nobody else could see yet. She kept it in a chipped frame next to a kerosene lamp she refused to throw away, even after the electric company finally stopped shutting them off. Imani had carried a folded copy of that photograph in her wallet every day since medical school, behind her insurance card, where nobody ever thought to look. She had read library books on anatomy before she ever set foot in a real classroom, had taught herself the names of every bone in the human hand by flashlight. Because the power got cut twice that one winter. A guidance counselor once told her, gently enough that it took years to recognize the insult inside it, that a community college nursing track might be a more realistic fit. Imani said thank you, and applied to 4 research universities instead. Scholarships followed, then a residency in trauma surgery that broke 2 of her classmates and made her faster, calmer, and quieter. The kind of surgeon attendings stopped double-checking after her second year. She remembered every attending who had once asked her, in the gentlest possible voice, whether she was sure she was in the right rotation, and she kept their names in a private list she never showed anyone, not out of bitterness, just so she would never forget what it had taken to get here. By the time the search committee at Eastlake Memorial called her, unanimously, after a national search that ran 14 months, she had built a career almost nobody at this hospital knew the shape of, and she intended to keep it that way for a little while longer. She wore the same plain cardigans she'd worn in residency. She drove a 12-year-old Honda with a cracked driver's mirror she kept forgetting to fix. She took the back stairwell instead of the executive elevator because she liked hearing how staff talked when they thought no one above them was listening, and because, if she was honest with herself, some old instinct still expected to need an exit that didn't draw attention. Eastlake Memorial was the kind of hospital that put its name on highway billboards. A donor wall the size of a school bus lined the main lobby, brass letters listing families who had given wings and wards their own surnames. Surgeons there got invited to deliver keynote addresses at national conferences. It was exactly the kind of high-prestige institution where a quiet woman in a gray cardigan could walk the halls for 6 days completely unrecognized, and exactly the kind of institution where the eventual reckoning would carry the farthest. Gary Hutchins had run environmental services and general operations at Eastlake for 11 years, and in that time he had built a small, comfortable kingdom. He called the loading dock my dock and the third floor my floor, and he had a habit, well known but never written down anywhere official, of deciding within 4 seconds of meeting someone exactly how much courtesy they had earned. 3 formal complaints against him were sitting in a folder in Human Resources, each one stamped resolved, no further action needed by a director named Carol Iverson, who preferred a quiet office to a difficult one. Most of the staff who reported to Hutchins kept their heads down and did their jobs well, including a young orderly named Derek Massey, who had once tried to push back on Hutchins's behalf assignments and gotten his hours cut the following month for it. Derek noticed the woman in the gray cardigan that first week too, noticed the careful, unhurried way she moved through the building, and decided, without knowing why exactly, to treat her like she mattered. It would matter more than he realized. The trash incident was not the first thing that happened to Imani that week. It was the 5th. On her second day, before she had told anyone her title, a unit secretary handed her a stack of patient meal trays and asked her to run these down before the supervisor sees them sitting. Imani carried the trays, the plastic lids warm against her forearms, the smell of overcooked green beans following her down the hall. She said nothing. On her third day, in a stairwell that smelled of old paint and mop water, she heard Hutchins tell another employee, just loud enough to be sure she'd hear it over the echo of the concrete steps, "They're hiring different lately. Lower the bar a little, you get more of them in the building." She kept walking, one hand trailing the cold metal rail. Her jaw tightened, released. On her 4th day, a printed sign and sheet for the surgical staff lounge appeared with her name missing from the roster, while a junior intern who started the same week was already listed with full access. When she asked the front desk about it, Hutchins answered for them. Arms crossed over a chest, puffed out half an inch too far. "That lounge is for actual staff," he said. "I'm sure wherever you're supposed to be has its own break room." A surgical resident standing 3 feet away looked at the floor and traced a seam in the tile with the toe of his sneaker. A second nurse turned and busied herself with a chart that did not need updating. Nobody said her name. Nobody said his was wrong. That same afternoon, a formal-looking memo went out under Hutchins's name, citing unauthorized presence in restricted clinical corridors, naming no one directly but time to land an hour after Imani had walked the cardiac wing alone. Badge still turned backward out of habit. Carol Iverson read it at her desk, initialed it without lifting her eyes past the first line, and filed it without a question, the way she had filed 3 others just like it over the past 2 years. Then came the trash bag, On the sixth day, in the hallway outside the nurses' station, in front of a dozen witnesses who would all later swear, at first, that they hadn't seen anything clearly, that the lighting had been bad, that they'd been looking at a chart, that they couldn't be sure exactly what they'd heard. One nurse near the med cart actually turned and walked into a supply closet rather than be asked a single question about what she'd just watched. Through every rung of it, Imani said nothing back. Not the trays, not the stairwell comment, not the lounge, not the memo, not the coffee grounds soaking into her shoe. She had learned a long time ago, in rooms far worse than this one, that the first person to raise their voice in a hospital corridor is the one remembered afterward as the problem. So she swallowed it. She let her hand close and open at her side, half-moon marks pressed faintly into her palm by her own fingernails. She thought of her grandmother's ribbon, folded behind the insurance card in her wallet, and kept walking. At least 24 people had a clear view of one rung of that staircase or another, and almost all of them looked away the moment it happened. A med student studied a chart he had already memorized. A janitor pushed his cart a little faster than usual. The front desk clerk found something urgent to type. Derek Massey was the only one who didn't look away. He met Imani's eyes across the nurses' station the day of the lounge roster and gave her the smallest nod, the kind that says, "I saw that, and I'm sorry," without risking a job he couldn't afford to lose.
Man, I don't know how she's still standing there calm. I would not have made it to incident 2. But something tells me this man has no idea what he just stepped in. Let's keep going.
What none of them knew was that a nursing student named Priya Okonkwo had been charting 2 feet from the nurse's station when the bag tipped, and her phone, propped against a supply caddy for a medication video she'd been recording for a class assignment, had caught 11 seconds of the whole thing in the corner of the frame. Hutchins's voice, the bag tipping, Imani's shoes. She didn't tell anyone right away. She just saved the file, hands shaking a little as she renamed it, and sat with it for 2 days. The way you sit with something you're afraid to use and afraid to lose. The hospital had scheduled an all-staff town hall for that Thursday, a routine quarterly briefing in the auditorium, the kind most people attended for the free coffee and left early from. CEO Margaret Sutter opened it the way she opened every one of these meetings, with a slide of upcoming construction and a reminder about flu shot compliance. Then she clicked to the next slide, and the room's idle murmur died. Before we move on, she said, "I want to formally introduce someone many of you have already passed in the halls this week without realizing it." The slide behind her showed a photograph and, beneath it, a title in plain block letters. Dr. Imani Reeves, Chief of Surgery. Dr. Reeves comes to us from County General's Level 1 trauma program, where she ran one of the highest survival outcome units in the region. She started with us 6 days ago. I understand a few of you have already met her, in one way or another. Hutchins, seated near the back with his arms crossed, went very still. The woman from the corridor walked up the center aisle in the same gray cardigan, climbed the 3 steps to the stage, and stood beside Margaret Sutter without a flicker of triumph on her face. That was the first wave, the identity nobody in that room had bothered to ask about, sitting now in plain block letters above their heads. "There's something else," Margaret said. "We've received a video, submitted voluntarily by a member of our nursing program, that I think this room needs to see." The lights dimmed. 11 seconds played twice, in silence, on the screen behind them. The bag, the tilt, the spill, the voice. A woman near the front audibly gasped on the second playback, even though she'd already heard it once. And somewhere in the middle rows a chair creaked as someone shifted, unable to sit still through it. When the lights came back up, Margaret let the silence sit for a long 4 seconds before she spoke again. "This is the 4th complaint involving Mr. Hutchins that has crossed human resources in 2 years. The first 3 were marked resolved. They were not resolved. They were filed." That was the second wave. Proof that what the room had just watched was not an isolated bad afternoon, but a pattern someone had been protecting for years. Carol Iverson, 3 rows from the front, did not look up from her lap. Effective today, Margaret continued, Gary Hutchins is terminated from Eastlake Memorial, pending a formal review by our board's ethics committee and, given the pattern documented in this footage, a referral to outside counsel. Ms. Iverson, you and I will be speaking immediately after this meeting about every complaint you have personally marked resolved in your time here. That was the third wave, the machinery of the institution finally moving in real time, in front of the very room that had been trained to look away. She turned toward Hutchins directly. Mr. Hutchins, you have something you'd like to say to this room. He stood. His tie suddenly felt too tight. You could see it in the way his hand went to the knot and didn't loosen it. He read from a card someone had clearly written for him, his voice flat and small in a room built to hold 500 people. I regret the incident in the corridor, he said. Dr. Reeves has proven to be determined. A few people in the back audibly exhaled, not in relief, in disbelief. That was the fourth wave, the apology nobody had asked him to mean, extracted in front of cameras that would not let him take it back. Imani did not smile. She did not raise her voice. She stepped to the microphone for exactly 1 sentence.
The trash on my shoes never told you who I was, she said, and it never should have needed to. Then she stepped back from the microphone and let the room sit with that. Determined, that's the word he reached for? After all that, man's apology was worse than the trash bag. Somebody get this man off the stage. The fallout did not stop at Hutchins.
Within a week, the ethics committee placed Carol Iverson on administrative leave pending review of every complaint she had ever marked, resolved without investigation. 2 of those complaints belonged to other black staff members who had quietly left the hospital years earlier, rather than fight a system that had already decided not to hear them. The hospital's board rewrote its complaint intake policy within the month, requiring every report against a supervisor to be reviewed by someone outside that supervisor's chain of command, with a mandatory written response within 5 business days. Hutchins's termination letter cited gross misconduct and a documented pattern of discriminatory treatment, language his attorney would later spend months trying and failing to soften in a wrongful termination claim the board's outside counsel had little trouble defeating. The junior intern who had been handed lounge access ahead of Imani sent a private, awkward apology that Imani accepted with more grace than it probably deserved. Priya Okonkwo was offered, and accepted, a permanent research assistant position in the surgical department, the kind of opportunity that does not usually find nursing students 2 years into their program. Imani never filed a personal claim for damages. When the board offered a settlement in recognition of the incident, she declined to take $1 of it for herself and asked instead that the funds seed a scholarship for first-generation nursing and pre-med students from low-income households, naming it after the cafeteria worker who had raised her on a kerosene heater and a single ribbon on a mantle. The May Reeves Scholars Fund made its first award the following spring, $4,000 and a mentorship slot to a 17-year-old from 2 counties over who had never set foot in a hospital that wasn't an emergency room, and whose mother cried in the parking lot reading the acceptance letter twice before she trusted it. 8 months later, Eastlake Memorial unveiled a small brass plaque outside the surgical wing near the elevator bank. Easy to miss unless you were looking for it. It read simply, in honor of those who showed up anyway. May Reeves attended the unveiling in a wheelchair her daughter had finally convinced her to use, wearing a church dress she'd saved for the occasion, and when the cloth came off the plaque, she pressed both hands flat against her chest and did not say a word, because there wasn't one big enough. Imani stood beside her the whole time, in scrubs now instead of a borrowed cardigan. Badge turned the right way around at last, and didn't let go of her grandmother's hand. 2 years after that, Eastlake's surgical wing carried a new name on its donor wall, not Imani's, by her own request, but the wing's pediatric trauma bay was renamed in memory of the cafeteria worker who had spent 31 years feeding a hospital 2 hours north of this one. Derek Massey finished his nursing degree on a tuition assistance program Imani helped design specifically for support staff who wanted to move up without quitting their jobs to do it. Carol Iverson never returned to Eastlake. She found work eventually at a smaller clinic across the state, somewhere with fewer files and fewer people to bury them under. Hutchins's name still surfaces sometimes in licensing board records that follow him from job application to job application, longer than he ever expected a single trash bag to follow him. Listen, this story was fiction, every name and every hallway. But if you've ever had somebody decide who you were before you opened your mouth, look you up and down and make a judgment in 4 seconds flat.
You already know the feeling underneath it was real. So tell me something. Has it ever happened to you, somebody underestimating you right up until the moment they couldn't anymore? Somebody finding out too late exactly who they were dealing with? Drop it in the comments. I want to hear the whole story. If this one got you, hit that like button, share it with somebody who needs to hear it today.
And subscribe, because we've got more of these coming every week. We'll see you in the next one.